Hello guys, hopefully your break is going well. This is your Chapter 23 lecture, and so we'll be working our way through the content of Chapter 23 with this lecture. I'm going to break this up in Chapter 24 and 25 into their own individual components, so you're able to get each of them in its entirety. And like I mentioned, we will then be testing after break, and we will also have a review day in between for us to be able to play our review game. First of all, with our Steel Empire, and then also to be able to ask any sort of questions you guys have on Monday night. So let's get started with Chapter 23. The title of the chapter is Political Paralysis in the Gilded Age from 1869 to 1896. And so this is the late 1800s, running all the way from the time period of Ulysses S. Grant's presidency, running up through the election of William McKinley in 1896. We're going to find for all these Gilded Age presidents, they are fairly weak presidents. They are all Republicans except for Grover Cleveland. And we're going to find that during this time period, the character of government is going to change. So we're going to see a change in what it's going to be our main issues, where instead of battling over slavery, we're now going to be battling over economics and morality instead. So let's get started. And if you have any sort of questions, feel free to email, or I'll save them for when we do our review in class, and we'll be able to cover everything. Now, because we've been covering a lot of this material inside of our Steel Empire game, a lot of this stuff I'm going to assume is going to sound familiar to you, but we'll be able to run it through then with your textbook to give you the comparison to the game that you guys have been playing. So when we take a look in the late 1800s, when we study the Gilded Age, remember the term comes from Mark Twain, where he believes that in the late 1800s you have a really good existence for a top group of people inside of our society, and then underneath you've got a lot of things going wrong inside of our society that needs reform or attention. But that focus is going to be divided depending on what your situation is during this time period. We'll find that economically, we do have booms taking off. And so what I typically find with my students is this is the time that my kids get very interested because of the fact that, as you can see from the street scene, you still have horses and other sorts of elements of old style society. But you see, this is Chicago in the late 1800s, and it looks very similar to what you would find in modern day Chicago, whether it's streetcars or the busy street scene with the skyscrapers going on. So we start off with our first president, Ulysses S. Grant. And what I mentioned to you guys initially when we were talking about Grant is the idea that he is somebody who is walking in with virtually no political experience. He is somebody who is a Republican strictly because he is supportive of the North. But we're going to find that with his presidential election, he's largely elected because of the fact that he is a hero for what he does during the Civil War. It's not because he's got these ideas that are amazing and great for our society. You'll also find that for Grant, he's got a bunch of issues happening in the North, the South, and in the West, where in the South he's got Reconstruction that is struggling after Johnson's presidency. Out West, you've got Native American attacks that are causing tension. And then up in the North, you've got industrialization taking place. And it's going to be that northern industrialization that's going to be key for us, because we're about to see the Republican Party changing in the late 1800s. The Republicans are going to go from the radical Republicans to a different Republican Party that is very much focused on the idea of helping to build business and industry inside of our society. For the Democrats, they're in deep trouble because of the fact that they're so hopelessly divided. In the Deep South, you've got Southerners who are going to want to figure out ways to hold on to their Democratic Party by keeping greenbacks around and keeping interest rates low. But we're going to find that there are other Democrats, like there are Democrats who are immigrants living inside the city. They're going to be wealthy Democrats who are going to be pushing against them, trying to figure out ways to go back to a gold standard. And for farmers, they're very much going to be pushing this idea of the Ohio idea, where they want to keep the money supply very much soft, where they want greenbacks, they want silver, and they're very much not interested in the idea of going back to a gold standard. So what you should be hearing there is you've got a Democratic Party that is very much disjointed. The Republicans are very much united at the end of the war, but they don't really have a united set of ideas that they're campaigning on that they're going to unite people like the abolitionist issue did for a large number of people up in the North. So with Grant, remember also he is going to be engaging in what's called waving the bloody shirt. That term you want to be able to use is to describe how many Republicans would be able to, in times of elections, claim that you shouldn't vote Democrat because they were the ones who started the Civil War and they killed many Northerners and they were unpatriotic and very much the enemies of the state. So the Democrats are in a really rough spot in the late 1800s as a result. For Grant's presidency, though, what you'll notice is that he is part of a party that needs to figure out ways to keep African Americans voting in the South in order for the Republicans to be able to win a lot of elections in the future. Because if African Americans lose control of the vote in the South, then you're going to have redeemers, Southern white people who want to go back to a situation that's like slavery. They'll be able to take control again, and then they will be able to then deny Republican victories in the House and the Senate, even if they can't stop presidential victories. So, we mentioned in class that this is a period called the era of good stealings by some people. We're going to find that there are a lot of scams going on. Like there are some railroads that are out there that will engage in all sorts of goofy things, like they'll sell scams of bonds to people. They will mess around with the stock market, like they'll do stuff like stock watering, artificially driving up the price of stocks so people will buy them, and then they'll be able to then sell off their stock for a lot of money, and then they'll crash the stock afterwards. And so they're able to scam people largely because of the fact that we are engaging in what's known as laissez-faire economics, or hands-off business. There's very little regulation of business. And the feeling is largely that business owners are good people who will then be doing what's good for America. There are also judges and legislators and other government officials who are willing to do things that are corrupt because they're willing to sell influence to people who are willing to pay them for that. Now, the question of is this bribery comes down to this term quid pro quo, which means that in a bribe, you are offered money, and then in return, you promise to give people an advantage or a deal as a return for that payment that they're making to you. In the late 1800s, this corruption is so widespread that there is no quid pro quo that's needed. People are just getting money from rich individuals who are then getting deals from the government, and they're able to then have a really good business situation, but as a result, you also have a lot of corruption inside the government. The other thing I want you to keep in mind is when you're studying this time period, you're going to see a rise in the number of people who are working inside the government. These paychecks that they get are not incredibly high, but a lot of people want these government jobs because of the fact that these government jobs can then charge fees for almost every service that these people provide. So if somebody's a tax collector, or if they're working as a postman or whatever, there's a bunch of different side scams that you can get into that will help make your paycheck a lot bigger, especially if you're willing to do things that are dishonest. And so a lot of people are trying to get their ways into positions of government, which is leading a lot of Americans to feel like government is corrupt because of the fact that there are now people who are using their position of power in order to get themselves rich. You're seeing the scandals emerging inside your textbook. Like this is your gold scheme that we talked about in class, where we talked about Gould and Fisk, who were trying to figure out ways to be able to set up a monopoly on gold. And they end up crashing the economy in 1869 because of the fact that they're able to bribe Ulysses S. Grant's brother-in-law to not sell off gold. And as a result, we're going to see the stock market crash. This should say 1869, not 1889. When the bubble broke and we had a bunch of people who were crashed out because of the fact that they were too strung out on gold, where they bought too much at too high of prices. Now notice what happens during this time period, because according to James Madison, the government is supposed to have checks and balances, but because Congress has a number of Republicans that are friendly with Grant, we're going to find that the Congress is going to look the other way with Grant and the people involved in the scandal by claiming that he was ignorant but not crooked. And as a result, you're going to find that people are going to be getting off of being convicted or accused because they're just going to claim that they didn't know any better. And ignorance typically is not an excuse for breaking the law, but in many cases in the late 1800s, that will pass. And this is going to give a lot of people the feeling that this is the Gilded Age, that the government is corrupt and that it is working very much for rich people, not for the benefit of poor people. We also see this taking place in the late 1800s when it comes to the idea of political machines. And we talked about political machines previously, where we described with political machines the idea that you've got individuals like Boss Tweed right here, who is going to use immigrants like these people. He's going to give them gifts, and in return, they're going to vote for politicians who are then going to be engaging in what we call graft. This graft is what we want to be noticing, because in the late 1800s, we're going to see that there's a lot of scamming of the government going on. You're going to have scamming going on where you have business interests that are bribing politicians to get them to do things like the gold scheme and the credit mobilier. You're also going to have immigrants who are getting help from nobody, and they're experiencing nativism, but people like Boss Tweed will be giving them money so that they can get the basics of life taken care of, but then it's also leading to corruption where they're electing politicians who are incredibly corrupt, and it's going to be a huge problem that we'll see taking place in the late 1800s. Now, for us, when it comes to political machines and the corruption happening with businesses, a lot of people want to focus on one or the other in the late 1800s. They're both pretty dirty. So we're going to find that Boss Tweed is engaged in one political machine in New York to try to help out the Democratic Party to get elected. There are Republican and Democratic machines all over the country. What we're going to find here is a reform effort that's taking place by a man named Thomas Nast. Thomas Nast is going to be a cartoonist. He is making up all sorts of cartoons like these where he's able to show people who are illiterate that there is a guy in Boss Tweed who is scamming Americans and taking government money so that he can give it away to immigrants a little bit, but largely he is keeping the money for himself. This scandal, though, is going to bring together all the things that a lot of common Americans are going to hate. You've got during this period an idea of nativism, where we've got a hatred of immigrants who are coming to the country, especially Irish, Southern European, Eastern European. There's a hatred of corruption, and there's a feeling that politics are kind of dirty. But in this case, it'll be very much used as an anti-democrat sort of movement when it comes to this sort of corruption. Whereas when we take a look at corruption with big businesses, a lot of people will feel like there's very little that they can do to make things better. The scandals that we'll see going on with big businesses are even more egregious than what we see going on with political machines. Like if you remember our Credit Mobilier scandal, where the Union Pacific created a fake company called the Credit Mobilier so that they could then pay themselves double, and they also gave gifts of stock to congressmen and the Vice President of the United States, and as a result, they're able to scam the government out of millions of dollars. And we see that being as one of many different scandals that's taking place. The whiskey ring we saw taking place, the Indian reservation scheme, and we're going to see Ulysses S. Grant stepping up repeatedly, and he's going to say over and over again that the people who are criminals in these schemes are not criminals. He is going to stand up for them and say, look, it's just a mistake, we got confused, these are really good people. And so you're going to see the president trying to cover up each of these scandals, and you're seeing a Congress that is willing to look the other way because they're on the same party, and secondarily, they're making gobs of cash off of the corruption that's taking place. We're going to see, though, that the Republican Party is about to split in 1872. We're going to have a liberal Republican Party, and the liberals are trying to figure out ways to reform the government. They're trying to figure out ways to get the dirtiness out of government, and they're trying to figure out ways to end military reconstruction because they feel like this is expensive. In this election, though, we already learned that Grant is going to win the presidential election of 1872 because the Democrats are still a mess. They have now endorsed a guy who is a radical abolitionist, who is somebody who is trying to figure out ways to end Reconstruction, but he's also claiming to get rid of all this corruption. And when they are going to get involved in waving the bloody shirt, a lot of these people who are voting for Horace Greeley are really divided over whether or not they actually like him as a presidential candidate. Grant is going to end up winning, though, because Grant is not going to be seen as having this dilemma where Horace Greeley, a former abolitionist, is now trying to explain to people that they should vote for him even though he's supporting the KKK and even though political machines support him. We're going to ignore in this election, though, that Grant is being heavily supported by large businesses that love the idea that he is then doing things to try to create a laissez-faire situation to help them out with doing business. We saw, though, in our class that Grant is going to get hurt by what happens at the beginning of his second term. We're going to have the Panic of 1873. The Panic of 1873 is really simple, and we're going to find that for a lot of our panics inside of U.S. history, we're going to see that an expansion is going to get over-exuberant. We're going to get a bubble forming where people are going to get so excited about investments that they'll start kicking in more and more money, building more and more stuff, even though they should be reading the signs that there's something going wrong. Earlier panics that we had, like 1819, 1837, 1857, was largely land speculation. This, though, is railroad speculation. We've got people who are building way more train tracks, building more mines, more factories, more farms than the people can actually pay for. We don't have enough buyers for all the stuff that they're building up. We also have bankers who are making really bad decisions on whether or not they should lend these businesses money, and there's really nothing to regulate them to say what they should or should not be doing. We've got our national bank system, but it's got very little bit enforcement arm, and during laissez-faire, it's up to the president to decide how much he wants to enforce those rules. We're going to find then that in 1873, people stop paying back their loans. The economy is going to start to shut down. We're going to find then that this crash is going to wipe out thousands of businesses. And we're going to see a lot of problems taking place. African Americans are going to get hurt. The Freedmen's Bureau and the Freedmen's Banks that are built at the same time period are going to crash out, and they're going to lose all of their cash. We're going to find that the worst people hurt are the people who are poor, white and black. And so this is where our new debate is going to come in over the idea of inflation and deflation. Remember what we talked about before we went into break? When we talked about our money supply, we talked about the idea of debt and money. So when we think about this, you've got two different styles of currency that we were talking about using previously. There are people who want gold money. This is known as a hard currency. These are typically the creditors who want this sort of money. These are the people who have lent out money, and they want to then get money back to them that is in the form of gold or specie. Meanwhile, you've got people who are engaging in soft money, and whether it's greenbacks or silver, these are typically your debtors. And these are people who want to get as much money in circulation as possible so that they're able to pay back their loans with greenbacks or silver, because what will happen is if we inflate the money supply, in this situation, prices will go up. Farmers will make more money. People will get more in wages. It'll make it easier to pay back the debts that they have built up. What we're going to see, though, in the late 1800s is most of the people in the government, especially Republicans, are going to be hard currency people, people who believe in the gold standard. And what they're going to do is they're going to start getting rid of greenbacks. They're going to try to figure out ways to get rid of silver money. And as a result, they're going to shrink the money supply, which means prices are about to go down. While that's bad for debtors who are going to owe the same amount of money no matter what happens to the economy, they're just going to have less money to pay back their loans, so the loans are going to be harder and harder to pay back. But if prices drop, I want you to think about your monopoly game. This will make it easier to build up your monopoly, because if you're rich and you already have cash and the prices start dropping, the life that you have is getting better and better. So we're going to see in 1874 that we're going to have a battle taking place. In 1874, Grant is going to get rid of many of these greenbacks. He is going to get rid of the idea of printing up more, and he's going to create the Resumption Act of 1875, where the government is going to start pulling paper money out of the system, and he's going to start replacing it with strictly gold cash. When he does that, if you have a lot of greenbacks already and you can trade in this crappy money for money that's going to be repaid in gold at face value, this is like funding at par. And remember that scandal we had during Hamilton's time? This is going to have the same situation where the rich are about to get a lot richer and the poor are not. In this chapter then, notice silver. For many poor people, this is their goal, is that if we need to have a precious metal, if we can't trust greenbacks because they're crummy, their feeling is that if we can start coining silver money, this will help to inflate our currency. So what you're about to see is in the late 1800s, the government is going to start coining silver after what's known as the crime of 1873. The government is going to start with strictly a gold standard, but as we discover more and more silver in the late 1800s, and we discover less and less gold, many people start pressing the government to start coining silver because they're afraid of contraction, deflation, prices dropping, and especially when the economy crashed. I want you to think about the way that our steel empire game worked. Many of you guys during the panic of 1873, you were really super excited. So in 1873, many of you guys bought businesses and you were willing to spend money because of the fact that your prices dropped. Your problem is that stock market crash went on for multiple years, and as you went out here, many of you guys started going bankrupt as well. Now the problem is this is for large business owners, but if you were already poor and then you go through this time period and your wages are dropping and the prices are dropping at the same time, but it's not something that you can do much with because you already start off with very little money, That becomes a very dangerous situation. It's also going to cause some radicalization where there are going to be many people who are going to come to the feeling that there's nothing in the government to help them out because of the fact that the rich people who are supposed to be taking care of our economy aren't doing it very well. So what we're about to see is that when the Republicans went with the gold standard, they see a gigantic radical change happening inside of our society. In 1874, we elected Democrats to the House of Representatives, not just from the South, but also in northern states. In 1878, we see a greenback Labor Party, people who are wanting to print more greenbacks to inflate the money supply. And all of the things that you see happening right here are people who are mad that as the crash goes on, the people who are poor are getting nothing. The rich people keep insisting that if we stay with the gold standard, that things will get better, but instead it's deflating the money supply, and the money is then becoming more and more scarce, and the economy is not recovering the way that it should. What we're going to find then is a debate that's going to emerge inside of our class from this point forward, which is this problem. When we have a crash, the problem that you're going to see happening with businesses is oftentimes with a crash, you will have layoffs and pay cuts. Your problem with layoffs and pay cuts is oftentimes this will lead to hoarding of money where people won't spend, and that will just help to make the crash worse. If we stick with the gold standard, that's nice if you've got cash, but if you've got no cash, you've still got this problem right here. So when you hear people talking about the idea of the gold standard, this is trying to help out the people who are supplying jobs. One of the things that we're needing in this situation as well is we don't need just to help out the business owners, we need to create demand. How do we get people spending money so that they're willing to actually go out and take risks with their cash to help turn around the economy? Because we need more buyers. So that's really what's going on in the late 1800s, is we've got this issue going on because of the fact that we've got a divide over what we should be doing with our money supply and who should we be helping. Should we be helping rich people, or should we be helping poor people who are struggling to get through? We're going to see as a result then that you're about to have a very divided time period. We will not have a strong federal government during this time period. The presidency and Congress will rarely be of the same party during this time period, and as a result, they're kind of checking each other. So we're going to go kind of halfway with the gold standard, halfway with soft money, and we're going to see that this divide is going to continue going forward. Now, for the Republicans, what I want to highlight for you is they're not just worried about economics, where they're interested in laissez-faire. There's also a religious and a moral thing that's happening inside the Republican Party as well, where many of the Republicans in the late 1800s want to impose Protestant faith onto people inside of our society. They start playing around with ideas like temperance, figuring out ways to limit alcohol consumption because they think that the immigrants are drinking too much alcohol. There are many of them who want to talk about laws about pornography and sexuality and birth control because they feel like those are immoral things as well that shouldn't be happening in Protestant society. They're going to be discussing in the Republican Party ideas about making polygamy illegal because they're nervous about what's happening out in Utah, where there's polygamy that's taking place, and many of them are bothered by that. So many Republicans in the late 1800s are talking about keeping their hands off business, but also getting the state and federal government involved in telling people individually how they can or cannot live their lives. And so we're going to find that they're very divided. In some cases, they like the idea of a weak central government. In other ways, they like the idea of a strong central government. For the Democrats, they've got a mass of different people who are part of their party. Southern Democrats who want to have states' rights over Reconstruction. Northern immigrants who are very much living in two different places. Some are living in cities, and many of them are facing nativism that's causing them problems. Many of them are Roman Catholics who are hated by the Protestants who are here inside of our country. And so many of the rules are being created, like prohibition, education. It's feeling like it's being applied to people in a nativistic sort of way. But the Democrats are going to get divided because much of their Democratic base in the South is agreeing in the nativism that's taking place, that Roman Catholics are scary, that we should be nervous about integration with Reconstruction. They are very much against Native Americans out west and Chinese people who are moving to the far west. And so we're going to see, as a result, for the Democratic Party, they're going to win statewide elections, especially in the South. Once Reconstruction is over, they'll take over every governorship in the South. They will take over Congresses, and they'll start winning their way back into the House of Representatives and the Senate. They're also going to have some victories happening up in the North with immigrants and political machines, but we're going to see that there are more Republicans in the late 1800s, and they're going to be doing better in elections because of the fact that they're much more united. So let's take a look at how we move forward from this point. One of the things that I want to be thinking about then is when you see elections in the late 1800s, the two political parties are not very different from one another. The political parties used to be very different. Our Democrats used to be way over here as conservative, especially over the issue of slavery, and our Republicans who are abolitionists who are very much over here. Now this is pre-Civil War, so this is prior to 1860. Our problem is in the Gilded Age, we're going to see movement take place where our Republicans are going to move then from being where they are at this time to being over here instead. They're going to very much want to maintain the status quo and protect what they see as the values of America, whether it's free enterprise, independence, freedom. And these Democrats are still maintaining a place over here where they're very much not talking about huge changes to society, especially since many of them are either trying to resist Reconstruction or keep in place the Gilded Age. So for us, what we're going to see is that our political groups are over here, and what they're very much focused on is not the idea of differences in viewpoint. They are very much agreeing on the idea of patronage. They're trying to give away jobs to their supporters. Their problem, the reason why they're having differences in elections then is who they're giving patronage to. If you're a Republican or a Democrat, your patronage looks different depending on who your constituency is, whether it's immigrants or business owners or whatever, and that's very much driving what they're deciding to do. We're going to find, though, over here, we're going to have groups like your radicals, and these radicals are going to be like abolitionists, socialists, communists, labor unions. And so you're going to have all these different groups that are pushing for change, but they're all going to be seen as radicals, especially given the fact that they're going to get swept away with nativism, the idea that these are immigrants who are bringing immigrant ideas to Americans. They're not going to get a whole lot of headway. So notice one of the names they give you, Roscoe Conkling. Be very careful with Boss Tweed, because while it's nice that Boss Tweed went to jail for his crimes, he was running a political machine, and when he got kicked out, he was replaced by another boss who then just took his place and continued doing what he was doing. So Roscoe Conkling is one of these political machine operators who is going to be working very much hard with his very much with his political machine to try to figure out ways to get patronage done. And what he's trying to do is the goal of every political machine. They're trying to figure out how can they control politicians that are higher up in the food chain. Can they get a governor? Can they get a senator, or so on? So let me give you three different groups of individuals that we want to notice then when we're talking about our political machines. One of the groups that we want to notice when it comes to change is going to be our stalwarts. A stalwart is somebody who is unchanging in their views. And so a stalwart is going to be a Republican who wants no reform. Stalwarts are going to be the hardcore Republicans who are always Republican no matter what. But you're going to have two different groups that are coming onto the scene. There are going to be people who come on the scene in this chapter who are known as mugwumps. These are Republicans who want reform. And they're willing to go so far that they're even willing to vote Democratic in the hope that they can get reform done. You finally have in the middle here a group that's going to give the derogatory term half-breeds. And this is very much a racist term, and it's meant to be that way, because these guys want reform, but they stay Republican. So when we look at the Republican Party in the late 1800s, they've got all the advantages of being the bigger, more united party, but they've got a problem. When it comes to the issue of reform, these guys are going to be divided into three different groups. And the thing that they just need is a spark to cause those divisions to start popping up to the surface. And the thing that's going to cause that is going to be the elections that are coming up soon. And so when we take a look at the election that is going to be happening during Hayes's presidency, Hayes is going to get elected. Hayes's election is going to be something that is known as the Compromise of 1877, because when we take a look at Hayes's election, he is going to win even though Samuel J. Tilden is going to get more popular votes, and even though 3 of the states seem to go for Tilden, even though you got a lot of voting irregularities happening there. So your Compromise of 1877 is simple. These states look like they're scamming the system. In order to get the election done, the Democrats could fight over these, and instead they're going to give these states to Hayes, allowing him to win, and then he is going to end military reconstruction. When he does that, that is going to allow the Republicans to win the election, and at this point, you're going to have Reconstruction then end. They spent a good amount of time talking about who's doing the counting of the election votes. I wouldn't spend a ton of time on that, except for noting the fact that it's Republicans who have a dominant number of people who are on that board. So your Compromise of 1877 is simple. Reconstruction is done, military reconstruction is over, and they're going to be removing the troops from the Deep South. This is going to make the South and white Southerners incredibly happy, and if you are a carpetbagger or a scalawag or an African American in the South, you're about to be terrorized quite a bit. When we look at this decision that's made then, for the Democrats, this is their best chance to get Reconstruction done, but we're about to freeze everything as a result. For the Democrats, they are also being told that they are going to be getting into the patronage that the Republicans have been enjoying when they've been involved in the presidency. They're going to be told that there's going to be business opportunities coming to the Deep South, and so we have a gigantic deal to determine the election results, but the election is not really a representation of what the voice of the people is. Especially given the fact that in the Deep South, you had many African Americans who were prevented from voting. This is in spite of the Civil Rights Act of 1875, because of the fact that you've got an attempt to try to end segregation in the Deep South, but much of these cases are going to be overturned by what's known as the Civil Rights cases of 1883. So let me give you a look at what that's all about. In the late 1800s, there is attempts by Southerners to try to figure out ways to unwind what was going on with Reconstruction, and particularly they want to unwind is the 14th Amendment, because the 14th Amendment makes everybody citizens, but what it also is getting into is the question of who gets to determine what the 14th Amendment covers. Is it covering just the rights that are guaranteed in the Bill of Rights, or is it the federal government's job to protect everybody's rights to be protected from being discriminated against? So with the 14th Amendment, one of the most famous cases is known as the slaughterhouse cases. Slaughterhouse cases are really simple, and it has nothing to do with slavery. Instead, just imagine that this is New Orleans right here, and New Orleans has running right through the middle of it your Mississippi River that goes off to the Gulf of Mexico. While under military reconstruction, just north of there was a slaughterhouse that was busy slaughtering cows. That's a terrible cow. This stylus is not working great. So they're slaughtering cows, and the junk from the cows is going into the river. That junk is then going down the river to the people of New Orleans, and they're drinking this polluted water. So this seems like a really cut and dried issue that should not be taking place. And during Reconstruction, the military government is going to be telling, the slaughterhouses they have to move. They sued, and what they said is the movement of these slaughterhouses is not a federal issue. They believed that this is an issue of states' rights, and the Supreme Court agreed with them. So what the Supreme Court is doing is it's limiting the power of the federal government, especially in protecting these people against these people. As weird as that sounds, this is eventually going to get us to our civil rights cases, where we're going to have a bunch of different cases that are brought from people in the Deep South who are arguing that the federal government is going too far and that they should not be as powerful as they are on any sort of issues. And so what we're going to see is in the late 1800s, the court is going to decide that the 14th Amendment that makes everybody in America citizens is only protecting you from government violation of your civil rights. If individuals or organizations or jobs or anything else decides to discriminate against you, the determination by the Supreme Court was that was totally legal as long as it wasn't the federal government that from doing that. When Rutherford B. Hayes pulls his troops out, and then this is put into place as the understanding by the Supreme Court, it just sets everybody in the Deep South on this path then where white supremacists can then redeem the Deep South. This cartoon popped up on last year's AP test, and it's very simple to understand, where you take a look at your dates. This is where we want to memorize our presidential years in office. 69 to 77 is Grant. And you can see that this cartoon is sympathetic to the South because the South is all burnt out. There are Union soldiers with bayonets who are protecting Grant as he's trying to crush our solid South. And then you can see Hayes right here when he ends Reconstruction with his let him alone policy. There is this feeling in the South that he is doing what he can to mend the wounds of the South, and you now see productivity with factories, with crops, and white and African American people working together. So this is a very rosy idea of what the end of Reconstruction is going to do for the South, and we're going to find the reality is much darker than that. You've already learned about that, though. So you learned about with your Redeemers when we were talking about Chapter 22, that the Redeemers are going to be using all sorts of tactics to try to attack African Americans, whether it's sharecropping and a crop lien system to try to keep African Americans in debt, whether it's Jim Crow laws that are essentially segregation policies dealing with elections as well, with literacy tests, voter registration laws, poll taxes, and so on. There are efforts to try to return African Americans to a state of slavery, where this is a prior to the Civil War slave plantation. This is what sharecropping looks like, where sure, all the cabins are now scattered out throughout this plantation, but all these people now have to pay rent, which means that this is actually worse in many ways than slavery because these people are stuck. In the South, then, you're going to find that there's resistance to Reconstruction, and eventually the Supreme Court is just going to end Reconstruction attempts totally to try to create equality with the court case Plessy versus Ferguson. There's a man who is in the South who is a fraction African American blood, and in 1896 he is going to get onto a segregated train to try to be able to get onto a white train car, and the Supreme Court is going to argue that he can't go on to the white segregated train car because he's African American, and while he's not going to be in the train car, the argument is that as long as there's a separate train car that is roughly equal to the white train car, that then satisfies the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. This will lead us to our segregated drinking fountains, bathrooms, buses, public schools, and so on that are just going to cement the idea of segregation taking place. We're going to find also in the Deep South that this is not the end of punishments. Instead, we're going to see in the late 1800s, there's a record number of lynchings. And if we keep in mind that there's 365 days in the year, you'll see many times where we're going to have nearly a lynching every other day of both white and African American people. So these would be scalawags, carpetbaggers, people who are seen as being sympathetic to African Americans. They're going to be killed in order to send a message to them that they need to stop helping out African Americans. This is where we transition then into new things that are taking place. So remember, we're in the middle of the Panic of 1873 when Hayes becomes president, and it's still dragging on. It's known as the Long Crash because many of you guys experienced the feeling of will this thing ever end during our Steel Empire game. So for the railroads, they're making gobs of cash, but like you guys saw with your Steel Empire game, many of you guys did not want to do things to try to improve your workers' wages, improve their safety conditions, and so you saw in your textbook the Great Railroad Strike that happened during Hayes's presidency. When this Great Railroad Strike happens, instead of trying to stand up for the workers, Hayes is going to pull federal troops from the South to the North to try to crush the strike movement. Much of that decision is happening because of the fact that for Hayes and many of the people that he's with, they see many of the strikers as being these individuals, radicals, anarchists, socialists, communists, labor unions, and he is very nervous about them, and so are the business owners that are on his same team. We're going to see then that there's a situation happening where inside of our country, the government is not just laissez-faire. They are willing to use a lot of tools to try to crush any attempts by poor people to try to figure out ways to change the situation. For elections, they are very much set up so that your choices are very poor, whether you've got a Democrat or a Republican. They're not going to do much to change the status quo. They're just more focused on patronage and the corruption that you see going on there. And one of the divisions that's going to happen is for many people inside of our society, they're going to figure out ways to split reform movements by using nativism and racism to try to destroy those movements. Like when we think about Chinese people inside of our country, they were brought to America to dig in gold fields, to try to create the Transcontinental Railroad. The argument was made that because the Chinese had built the Great Wall of China, they could be part of the Pacific Railroad that was moving from west to east to try to build up the railroads quickly. Many of them were brought over, and they were almost all men. And the idea was that the men would come over, they would work, then they would die, and they wouldn't leave behind a Chinese society that was living inside of our country. In fact, there were many Americans who were worried that if too many Chinese people moved in, they would take over the country totally with their culture and their viewpoints. So we're going to find that many of these people are being labeled as coolies, which is essentially the idea that these Chinese people are servants or slaves, even though they weren't. But this mentality is going to be built up in many Americans as a way to then have backlash against the Chinese when they're seen as not being valuable, or else if they're seen as being too assertive and trying to move into society. This eventually will lead to the Chinese Exclusion Act, where they're going to shut down immigration from China in 1882 because of the viewpoints that they can't be true Americans because of the fact that they aren't like the white Protestants who are living here already. So we're going to see tons of racism that's coming out against the Chinese, although if we keep in mind the two groups that we have right here, these are workers who are forming a union, the Working Men's Union, and they're fighting against the Chinese. We're going to find that these two groups, though, have much more in common with one another than the business owners themselves. And in fact, the business owners will oftentimes use Chinese by hiring them at lower wages than what the unions want to get the union members mad at the Chinese people. So we're going to see that there is going to be this art form that's going on for people who are in power and don't want reform. They will use racism and nativism to turn groups against each other so that then reform won't be able to gain the necessary movement to be able to get it moving. We will find that the Supreme Court is going to rule on the idea that in the 14th Amendment, if you are born inside the country, you are a citizenship. You are a citizen and you get citizenship. But that's going to just lead to then the idea that all Chinese people need to stay out of the country, because if you can be born here and a citizen of the country, then there's a fear that they will change what America is. We're going to find then that in 1880, this is where the tenor of our chapters are going to change. James Garfield's going to get elected president. He is going to have as his vice president a guy who's coming from the political machines of New York, Chester Arthur. When Garfield wins the election, Garfield is going to be heavily involved in the patronage system, where he is going to be giving away an awful lot of government jobs that do not have tests applied to them. But what this chart is showing you is more and more of the government jobs from this point forward are going to have tests or other sorts of standards applied to them to see whether or not you are qualified to be serving the job. The reason for this is simple. Remember the story that I told you about Garfield's assassination, where his doctors are going to kill him with their infected fingers going into Garfield's back. This is because of the shooting of Charles Guiteau, who is going to shoot Garfield. Garfield's assassination is then going to lead to a recognition that we've got a bad system going on. Garfield's death is going to activate this group of individuals and this group of individuals. Where the stalwarts could say in the past, we don't need reform because why would we ever need to change the way our system is going? Mugwumps and half-breeds are going to start telling Republicans they need to change the system because it's corrupt. One of the changes is going to be the Pendleton Act, and this one's simple. This law just says that there are certain government jobs that are so important that you must pass a test in order to be able to get that job inside the government. This is going to create a civil service commission to figure out what government jobs do require this sort of test. And we're going to find that a lot of our patronage is going to go away, where a lot of people are going to lose the ability to influence the government because their work could help then get somebody elected. So what's weird is, as a result of this situation where you had a lot of people seeking patronage and helping out a politician, when the politicians can't give away these government jobs, something odd's going to take place. They still need cash, and they're going to start going to big corporations for donations and influence. And so we're going to see, as a result of the Pendleton Act, some corruption will go away, but then the businesses run by Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, and those sorts of guys are going to get even more powerful. And we're going to see that become a huge element in the late 1800s. For the Pendleton Act, we're going to see that this is going to be very odd for Chester A. Arthur to pursue, because he was somebody who was involved in the political machines. And in fact, he made a lot of people mad because he's trying to do what little he could to deal with the corruption that is happening. So he's only going to serve the rest of Garfield's presidency, and then he'll be done. In 1884, then, we have an election that is going to be dividing the Republicans into mugwumps, stalwarts, and half-breeds. For James G. Blaine, he is going to be the guy who is running for election, and he is seen as a corrupt politician who is very much with the business interests, and there are a lot of Republicans who do not like him being president. They instead want a reformer, and they decide to go to the extreme of voting for the other party, Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland's nickname is Grover the Good. He is known as somebody who has fought against corruption in his role in New York, trying to figure out ways to root out political machines. And for Grover Cleveland, he is going to be somebody who is elected, even though he's involved in a gigantic scandal that happens in 1884. The scandal is simple. The argument was that Grover Cleveland had a baby when he was not married to this woman. Now, we are not certain if he actually was the father for the child or if one of his friends was, because he'd been a bachelor forever. For Grover Cleveland, though, what he decided to do is he started sending cash payments to this woman to take care of this child who may have been his son. And when he was approached by the scandal, he was being accused by Blaine's people of having a child out of wedlock, out of marriage. For Grover Cleveland, though, what he demonstrated was one of the tactics that can be used by a politician. Instead of trying to argue that it wasn't his child, he instead came out and said, yes, that's my baby, and I'm the person who gave birth, had that child, and as a result, I've been taking care of that child, which is what I should be doing. I made a mistake, and I'm hoping you can forgive me. His argument, though, was that you could either vote for Grover Cleveland, who will own up to his mistakes and take care of a child who is his, or you could vote for a guy like James Blaine, who is willing to start trying to scandalize people and make issues out of people's personalities rather than focusing on the issues. And that's going to help Grover Cleveland to get elected in the election of 1884. Now, for Grover Cleveland, he is going to barely get into the presidency, and he's going to have a Congress that is full of people who don't like him. And so he's going to be battling constantly throughout his 4 years while he's inside the presidency. Notice also the way that Republicans are attacking the Democrats, because they're arguing that the Democratic Party is all about drinking too much alcohol, spreading Catholicism, and also causing rebellion through the idea of embracing labor unions, reform, and other sorts of things. So for Grover Cleveland's presidency, he is the first Democrat elected since James Buchanan, but what I want you to notice is he is not very different from what you saw going on with the Republicans. He believes in laissez-faire economics. He wants to be hands-off. He mentions that when there are farmers who are struggling in 1887 in Texas, he mentioned that the people should support the government should not support the people. So his ideas do not sound like modern-day liberals who believe in government intervention to try to help out. Instead, Grover Cleveland is very much similar to Republicans. He's just different in the idea that he's willing to talk about reform, and he's willing to push to try to change the way that the government is working. But without a Congress on his team, he is not going to be able to get a whole lot of stuff done. He's got a bunch of Democrats who have also been on the outside when it comes to the idea of patronage, and Cleveland is stuck because all of those people want jobs while he's talking about reform. What we'll see then is that with Grover Cleveland, he has got huge issues taking place. One of the biggest comes from the idea that for Grover Cleveland, he's got a group of people who have been lobbying the government because they notice that our tariffs have been working incredibly well. We've got way more money inside the government than we've ever had previously, and it's just sitting there. Now, nobody wants to get rid of the tariffs in the Republican Party because it's helping out businesses, but instead they feel like they should be spending that money to do things to help out, and one of the things they want to spend money on is to give away pensions to individuals who fought for the North during the Civil War. For the president, he is going to veto that and hundreds of other bills. He will veto more bills during his time in the presidency than every other president added together, because the Republicans' Congress are sending him, a Democrat, these bills that are full of Republican ideas of what they want to get done. For Grover Cleveland, he is going to find that this tariff is going to be something that's loved by Republicans, and it's creating a surplus. This is the thing that's paying for most of our business, for most of our government inside of our country. But notice that this type of tax is a regressive tax. It's hurting poor people more than it is hurting rich people. And so we're going to find that Grover Cleveland is not a huge fan of this tariff, but he's also facing a Congress that loves this tariff. So what we'll see is Grover Cleveland is going to fight a battle over the tariffs, and he's going to try to figure out ways to lower the tariff schedules. His problem, though, is that when he tries to create this bill, he is going to make this appeal for a new bill that would then lead to higher taxes in other places to pay for all the spending they've done. It would also argue that we would have more competition from businesses outside the country, and this would lead to unemployment. So for the Republicans, they're arguing that Grover Cleveland has no idea what he's up to when he tries to lower tariffs, and so this is going to lead to the election in 1888, where Grover Cleveland will run against Benjamin Harrison. Benjamin Harrison is the grandson of William Henry Harrison, who was president previously, and he is very much being helped out by our biggest of business interests. People like J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller are all trying to help get this Republican elected to get rid of a reformed Democrat. What we'll see then is when Benjamin Harrison wins the presidency, he is going to win just by the slimmest of margins, and the Congress is going to get filled with Republicans as well, but not enough to be able to pass all the bills they want to without Democratic resistance. For the Democrats, they're going to start stalling, and they're going to get involved in a thing that is kind of humorous because of the fact that they would figure out the rules of the way that the House of Representatives worked, and they would then use them. So what would happen is that when a bill was brought up in the House, they would start debating. The bill would then be brought to a vote, but in order to create a vote, you must have a quorum call where you take attendance, and you must have a certain number of people in attendance for a bill to get considered for a vote. What the Democrats would do is they would chat, then the vote would come up, and they would call out the roll call, and all these guys would sit silently and not actually answer when their name was called, so they technically weren't in attendance, even though they could visibly be seen. This was known as the silent quorum. But we're going to have Thomas Reed of Maine, who will get the nickname Czar Reed, because as Speaker of the House, he is going to be the guy who's going to change the way that these quorum rules are going to work. What he is going to do is he's going to announce on a day inside of Congress, he's going to announce his Reed rules. And his Reed rules are going to say that if you were present inside the hall and you did not answer, you then are going to be very much still counted as being present. And so these Democrats who are all smug and they would just sit there when the roll call would be done and they would do nothing, Reed now will just look around and go, I see you there, I see you there. And so numbers of Democrats did a bunch of different things on the first day of Reed's rule. Some of them tried to hide under their desks. Some of them rushed up to the front to try to attack Reed. The most funny of the stories is there's a Texas Democrat who just sat back in his chair, put his feet up, took out a big knife, and just started sharpening the knife in the back of the room as a signal of what he wanted to do with Czar Reed when the session was done. Now, what Czar Reed is going to do is, now that the Republicans are back in control, he wants to try to figure out ways to get Republicans to get more voters to support them. So number one, he is going to accept the recommendation of the Grand Army of the Republic, and he's going to start giving out pensions to Civil War veterans all over the place in the country. It's going to give pensions to the veterans and their wives, and if the person who's a veteran dies without a surviving wife, then their children will get a pension going on in the future. They're going to spend money like it's going out of style, and the idea is that these Civil War veterans in the next election will have to make a decision. If they want to keep getting their pension, they better vote Republican because Democrats don't like this idea. This pension plan, though, is so outlandish in the way that it's written, is that we have had people living into the 2000s who were Civil War veteran widows. This one right here, Gertrude Janeway, was our last of our Civil War widows who passed away. She was born in July 3rd, 1909. So you'll notice that is 40 years after the Civil War was done, and she didn't die until 2003. You'll notice the story down here. She fell in love with this guy, John Janeway, at the age of 16, got married to him in 1927 when she was 18, and he was 81, and then she was able to live off of his pension until she died about a decade ago. Our last Civil War child just passed away recently as well in 2014. Her dad fought in the Civil War, and so as a result, she was able to collect a pension because of the fact that her dad passed away without a surviving wife, and so she was able to collect $73.13 per month all the way up until very recently. What you see happening here then is pretty simple. What the Republicans are about to do is they're about to spend all of the money inside the government so that there's no ability to then reduce tariffs coming up in the future. And in fact, the McKinley tariff will raise those tariffs. They're also trying to win back farmers, and so they're going to announce that the government is going to start purchasing silver for the purpose of using that to inflate our money supply. So they're trying to win over Civil War veterans, farmers, and businesses to becoming the new Republican Party, and they're willing to spend down all of this money that we've got built up inside the government because of our tariffs. What we're going to find, though, is these tariffs are going to be catastrophic. For the farmers, they're going to have to buy goods from American businesses because they can't buy stuff from Europeans since the tariff is so high. And when they try to ship their stuff outside the country, they're running into a tariff that the other countries are creating to match our tariff. And so the farmers are having to pay high tariffs to sell their stuff, and they're also getting very little money inside of our country because of the fact that there's overproduction, and they've got these debts that are built up, and these farmers are becoming more and more radical. In 1890, the Republicans are going to lose control of the Congress, and we're going to find that there's a brand new group of individuals, a farmers' alliance that are united together, of farmers in the South and the West who are mad about what's happening with government. Now, these farmers, what they should be realizing is that they've got a lot in common with people like northern factory workers, with people like the Chinese and the Irish train workers that are working out west, and with African Americans in the Deep South, and all of them are much more similar to one another than they are similar to the white business owners who are running like United States Steel or J.P. Morgan's Baking or John D. Rockefeller's Oil. We're going to find with the farmers then, they're going to meet together and they're going to go from just being in an alliance system to then forming what's known as the People's Party or the Populists. And I want you to keep that name in mind when you're studying this chapter. Remember Donald Trump, he was the person who ran a populist campaign last year with the idea that he was representing the little people in society who are trying to fight back against injustices. So you remember last year Donald Trump claimed that he wanted to drain the swamp. That's what you see happening here, where these guys are trying to root out governmental injustice. When we hear them talking about like trying to figure out ways to break up monopolies on railroads and telegraphs, to create the direct election of senators, which means that instead of letting a state legislature choose the senators, you get to vote for that person. The creation of the initiative and referendum, which means these are ballot initiatives where you can put stuff onto ballots to vote on whether or not things should become law rather than trusting your Congress. All of these are reforms. Notice also, they want to change taxation. They're tired of tariffs, which is a regressive tax. They would like to have a graduated income tax, so the more money you make on a yearly basis, the higher percentage you pay in taxes, because you're more capable of being able to pay for the stuff that is making America as good as it is, whether it's roads or bridges or railroads or schools or that sort of stuff. But this is what I really want you to tune into for this chapter, the idea that they want to create inflation with the free and unlimited coinage of silver. It looks very simple. The idea is going to be this, that when it comes to the coinage of silver, they want to take one piece of gold, which is equal to one gold certificate. They want to add into that the idea that one gold certificate will also be equal to 16 pieces of silver. So they want to massively increase the amount of silver that's floating around. Our problem, though, with this situation is pretty simple. They keep finding more gold out west. They keep finding more silver out west, and they aren't finding any more gold out west. And so what this ratio should be is instead of one gold being equal to 16 silver, the ratio should actually be like one gold is equal to like 32 pieces of silver. So when you study what they're talking about in this chapter, they're actually talking about a massive government giveaway of cash, where if they are giving people a gold certificate for 16 pieces of silver, that's kind of like if the bank was running a deal today where if you brought in 2 quarters, you would then get $1. So they're running a situation that is not economically sound. But when we look at populism, remember what we talked about with populism, whether it was with Andrew Jackson or other populist movements, populism also oftentimes is a simple solution to a complicated problem. And for many farmers, they're not worried about if this makes sense. Many farmers are afraid that if they don't get help from the government, they're going to go bankrupt soon. And so this is a very radical idea of messing with the currency to get that done. This is especially because of the fact that we are now seeing uprisings take place, like the Homestead Strike in 1892, where you see strikers in a steel plant, kind of like we saw inside your game, where we had 300 armed detectives who came in, hired by Andrew Carnegie, to try to crush the Union, and we had many people dead and wounded, and the Union was broken. So the government and businesses are uniting on one side, and we're seeing that the poor people are starting to radicalize, whether it's workers in the factories or farmers. And this is making a lot of middle-income people very nervous because they're watching a very radical trend taking place, and they're not really certain what they should be doing to fix that. With the Homestead Strike, though, what we're going to see is this is not going to unite the country together into a path that they should take, but we will see that populism is rising. They're going to start winning more and more elections throughout the country. They're not close to winning the presidency, but we're going to see them start winning their way into places like Congress and other sorts of areas. And we're going to create a map that looks like this, where you can see out west a lot of people who are going green right here. But then also in the election of 1892, a lot of Southerners and Northerners vote Democratic, with the idea of sweeping out Harrison and the corruption that's going on with his presidency. Your problem, though, is inside the South. Many Southerners are going to break the radicalism that they see going on with populism because they'll start pointing out to poor white farmers that they're having to team up with African Americans, and they're going to play on the racism of these individuals to make them feel like they're not on the same team. So you're going to have a Farmers National Alliance created with African Americans. They're going to unite with white populists, and then we're going to see that there's a backlash that takes place. There's going to be tons of racism that's brought against the African Americans. This is when we see grandfather clauses, literacy tests, and poll taxes used to extreme amounts to try to take away the vote from African Americans. There's going to be Jim Crow laws that are made even stronger. And what we're going to see is that the Populist Party in the South is going to disintegrate into a white and an African American movement where united they might have had more political power, but they're going to divide into racism at this moment. Now, this is Grover Cleveland's moment again. He is the only president elected to 2 non-consecutive presidential elections. But what he's going to have run into is he is about to walk into one of the worst economic crashes ever in the Panic of 1893. Now, you'll notice I'm telling you that this is going to last for 4 years. From 1893 to 1897, you have an economic downturn that is going to crush many people inside of this society. Now, this economic crash is massive. They've got way too much overbuilding. They've got too little demand. The workers and the farmers do not have enough money to go buy the stuff that they need. And also, by going with free silver, they've created an economic crisis, especially when the United States is going to run into problems when European banks start watching our banks collapse and our railroads collapse, and they've been largely investing in our businesses. 8,000 businesses are going to fall apart in 6 months, but the thing that's going to make this crash really bad is really simple. When we go back to this standard right here, I mentioned to you that this chart should be 32 is equal to 1 piece of gold, but it's not. So what's going to happen is in the late 1800s during the Panic of 1893, many rich people who have the cash to do it will take 16 pieces of silver and trade it in for $1. They will then take that $1 and trade it in for 1 piece of gold. Not only will rich Americans be doing this, but also Europeans will be doing this as well. Europeans are going to be bringing boatloads of silver, which they don't want anyways, and greenbacks, which they've built up, and they're now going to start raiding our gold, and we want to be on a gold standard. So the Panic of 1893 is about to get really super messy. For Grover Cleveland, he's watching as our charities can't keep up. There's no way for them to create enough soup kitchens and charities to help out. And so you've got gangs of people moving around the country who have no jobs, they have no income, they have no food, and they're about to get more and more radical. He also is the leader of a government where he believes in laissez-faire economics, and he doesn't believe it's the government's job to help out poor people, and neither do Republicans. He now also has watched as Harrison has now spent all of our surplus away by giving away massive pensions to the Civil War veterans, and so we now don't have enough cash to even operate the government during this economic crash, and we're watching our money take off because of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. For Grover Cleveland, he is so desperate that he has to go to the monopoly owners in order to try to figure out ways to stop this crash from happening. We're going to find then that this is going to lead to the election of 1896. The farmers are going to choose this guy, William Jennings Bryan, to be their presidential candidate for the Populist Party in 1896. And the Democrats, who were normally part of the Populist Party, they're going to watch Grover Cleveland get rid of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. When he gets rid of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, it's going to stop the leaving of our money. So by February of 1894, we were down to $41 million worth of gold inside the United States. The United States was in so much danger of going bankrupt that they were about 2 weeks away from bankruptcy. But what Grover Cleveland is going to do is he's going to need to go to J.P. Morgan, the man who is running the banking system inside of our country. And J.P. Morgan, along with his friends, is going to be able to give a loan to the United States government to get them above $100 million inside their treasury. Two things I want you to think about, though. When J.P. Morgan gives a loan to the United States government, it's not like he's doing so out of the kindness of his heart. He has largely been taking part in cashing out American gold. So because we had this stupid idea with the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, he has now accumulated tons of gold that he's just sitting on. Number two, when he gives a loan to the United States government, he is lending America back its gold, but he's charging them interest. And so while he's doing something that's patriotic, he's also making gobs of cash. The other thing he's highlighting, though, is he is essentially acting as a banker of last resort. And we used to have one of those when we had our bus. Back with Alexander Hamilton, back with Henry Clay, a bus could have stepped in to get loans and to extend money and to print up more cash if we weren't so tied to the gold standard. But as a result of getting rid of all of that, we now need to depend on a private American who has more cash than he knows what to do with. Keep in mind also, when you're reading this chapter, he's going to give a loan of $100 million to solve this problem. He's going to buy U.S. Steel at the same time for about 4 times that amount of cash. And so J.P. Morgan is richer by far than the United States government, which brings the question, is that the best place for our money to be? Number one. Number two, is it really safe that our government needs to depend on a private citizen to save it in economic hard times? And for some people, they'll say that that's the way America should work. Other people will argue that we need even more reform because of the dangers that are created here. We're going to find then with Grover Cleveland, he is going to keep the government from going bankrupt, but he does nothing to fix the crash in 1893 that is going to cause the situation to turn around. We're going to find that with Grover Cleveland, he is going to be seen as a sellout to J.P. Morgan. For Grover Cleveland, he is going to argue that he is not a tool of the rich people, but when he passes the Wilson-Gorman tariff in 1894, he is going to give all these special mentions about how he wants to lower the tariff, and instead we're going to end up with a tariff that is going to cause the tariffs to go up. We're also going to see that there is now going to be an income tax that's going to be created, and with this bill, he is not going to sign it. He knows that the Republicans in Congress can pass it without his help, but what we're about to see during this time period is that when we've got a problem with demand, this cycle going on right here, we're going to see instead the price of everything go up because we're about to add in a tariff. If we add a tariff plus layoffs and pay cuts, we're going to see even more hoarding take place, and we're going to see that we're not creating demand. That is going to cause then the economic crash to get even worse. This is what Grover Cleveland is wrestling with, and so Grover Cleveland in 1894, he's head of a Democratic Party that looks like it's no different than the Republican Party. We're going to find then that with Grover Cleveland, he has now created an environment, though, for a rise in radicalism. because now the Democrats and the Republicans look like they're all the same, especially the Panic of 1893. And so we're going to watch this entire group over here rename itself, and all of these people are going to try to unite into a Populist Party of 1896. The problem with the Populist Party is it's going to struggle to convince all of these people to be on their team, because the one big issue they want to focus on is silver. Hopefully that helps you understand what's going on with the government of Chapter 23. It is by far the most confusing of the 3 chapters that you have been assigned for this break. And so I'll be able to take any questions you guys have. Chapters 24 and 25 will be coming up later today or tomorrow. And those will be a lot easier for us to run through in a quick sort of fashion, because they're dealing with industrialization and urbanization. Remember, also, any questions you guys have, we're going to be free to ask about those, and so feel free to let me know if there's anything I can do. But otherwise, hopefully your break is going well. I look forward to seeing you guys in a week and a half. Have a good day, guys.